Right, so kia ora. My name is Richard Edwards, and I'm from the Aspire 2025 Research Centre based in Wellington in New Zealand at the University of Otago. Thanks very much to the organisers for inviting me today, and thanks very much to all the presenters today, and particularly the early career researchers. I haven't managed to catch all the presentations, but the ones I have seen have been really, really good, and it's great to see the breadth and depth of the work that's going on. And I just acknowledge my colleagues at Aspire 2025 who have all, of course, have informed this talk, and particularly my co-directors, Anna Uwa and Janet Hook. Okay, so I'm going to talk about international progress and priorities to achieve a tobacco endgame. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to start off with a little bit about endgame thinking, then I'm going to go through a project where we're looking at the initial 6 countries which adopted national endgame goals and what's been the experience there. I'm going to then talk a little bit about endgame measures or interventions. And if there's time, and I may cut this out if we're a bit short of time, talk about the tobacco industry and endgames, and then sum up about progress and future priorities. So endgame thinking, to my mind, is sort of a way of looking at the world or tobacco control, and it rejects the sort of status quo. What by that I mean is a level of prevalence, which means that we have, thousands of deaths in Aotearoa, New Zealand, or millions around the world, and say that we want to get rid of smoking altogether, get it as close to 0% as possible. And I suppose I'm thinking of when I was in the UK, some of the strategies for tobacco control would say things like, over the next 10 years, we want to reduce smoking by about from 18% to 15% or something like that. And you'd think, well, that's not actually that ambitious. Surely we want to get rid of it or virtually get rid of it. And also a lot of the approaches have been somewhat incremental and quite business as usual in their approach. So I think those are the sorts of things that the endgame thinking, if you like, rejects. Oh, sorry, this is... so it advocates ending, not controlling the tobacco epidemic, and that means adopting radical endgame goals, and probably means we need to think about endgame, bold, innovative endgame interventions. Maybe it can be done just by intensified business as usual measures as well, but I think it certainly makes us think about that, and probably we need to take a strategic and planned approach. So this is an example of an endgame goal. So this is from Aotearoa. So in 2011, the government adopted this goal of reducing smoking prevalence and tobacco availability to minimal levels, thereby making New Zealand essentially a smoke-free nation. So that's an example of an endgame goal. And I think there's some potential advantages and disadvantages. I think the advantages, it gives us a clarity of purpose. We're very clear what we want to achieve. It's bold and visionary, which I think is good. Potentially, by being bold and visionary, it could create and generate public engagement and maybe policymaker engagement. And it could spur us to innovation and to action. And hence, all of those things could mean it accelerates prevalence reductions. On the other hand, it could actually distract from doing some of the core interventions if those are not in place. It could be impractical in some settings, perhaps particularly in lower middle income countries with less capacity. Ideological opponents might say that, look, this is overkill, this is nanny state gone mad, this is overbearing, what about personal responsibility, that sort of thing. And some of the measures could have unintended adverse consequences. And if those things together could mean it actually slows prevalence reductions compared to the normal approach. So it's not uncomplicatedly a good thing. And then, so that's endgame goals. And then one of the other facets of it is the endgame measures. And I've said these are measures that aim to permanently and rapidly reduce smoking prevalence to minimal levels when fully implemented. Whether any would do that on its own or whether they work in combination is up for discussion. But this classification, I think, was used by McDaniel in their paper in 2016. Product focus measures such as mandated nicotine reduction, user focus measures like the smoke-free generation, tobacco-free generation, or smoker license, supply focus measures like sinking lid on supply or radical reductions in retail availability. And then the sort of market institution structural type ones like the regulated market model or just nationalizing the tobacco industry. So there's a lot of sort of proposed endgame measures that might help achieve endgame goals. So what I want to talk about first of all is the experience from, as I said, the first 6 national governments, or at least I think they were the first 6, to adopt government goals at a national level. So this is a project that we've been running for a few years, and we have collaborators in each of those countries who are listed there, the lead collaborators. And I just acknowledge Janine Nip, who I think is on the call, who is working on this project with me, and Louise Thornley, who did so in the past. So the scope of this project is that to document document progress and experiences and learnings from endgame goals in these 6 countries. And that's been gathered through review of key documents and through collecting information through templates with the in-country informants and discussions with in-country informants. And the 6 countries are listed there. And so what I wanted to present was the findings up to 2018 and just a little flavour of what's been happening since. We're collecting data on that at the moment. So these are the goals. So they vary in the timeline, as you might expect. So Ireland, New Zealand and Sweden are all for 2025, and they span through to Canada in 2035. They were adopted over time. Finland was actually the first to adopt a goal in 2010, followed by New Zealand and then the others, and Canada was the latest one, I think in 2018 or 2017. The goals all talk about minimal prevalence. Generally, they say less than 5% as a sort of magic figure. Finland's goal is a bit different because it talks about, it's not just about smoking, it's about nicotine free. The others are just about smoking. And the New Zealand goal actually mentions minimal retail availability, although that wasn't a really big feature, at least in the government's thinking subsequently, even though it was mentioned in the goal. So when we looked at what had happened over the first few years, there were some similarities and some differences. So some of the similarities were in the context. So most of these countries had lowish smoking prevalence and declining smoking prevalence, and they had some of the key MPOWER measures that were mentioned in the last talk in place to varying degrees. Sweden was probably the weakest for that, and probably New Zealand and Canada the strongest, maybe Scotland as well. All of the countries had some form of strategy or action plan in place by 2018, except New Zealand. That is a government strategy or action plan. All of the countries had a focus on equity and on eliminating inequity. And they all had strong civil society or NGO engagement and partnerships. And that was particularly prominent in Sweden, Ireland, Finland, and Scotland. But another feature that was very obvious was that none of the countries had implemented any of those endgame interventions that I put up in the previous slide. And actually, none of them were even considering them in 2018. There were some differences. Obviously, there were some contextual differences, and those were noted as really important as in terms of culture and political climate and so on. As I said, the nature of the goal varied a little bit, with Finland's being nicotine free. The timelines varied a bit, and generally there was different approaches to harm reduction, with Finland being really rejecting sort of a harm reduction approach, and most of the other countries accepting it to varying degrees. So just in terms of the action plans, so I've pictured some of the action plans there on the right. The one on the left is the New Zealand one, but that was actually not a government action plan. That was one that was developed by the smoke-free sector itself, but it was not adopted by the government. But these action plans were generally pretty limited and as I said, did not include endgame measures, and had varying degrees of proposals for policy measures. All of the countries had this focus on equity. That was really strong in some countries. So for example, Scotland's strategy, and pretty much everything you read about Scotland's endgame goal talks about inequalities. In Scotland, it's really about socioeconomic inequalities in smoking. That's the focus. New Zealand was strong on this as well and had specific midterm targets for reducing smoking prevalence by ethnicity. And the understanding always was within the smoke-free sector in Aotearoa that the goal was to achieve minimal smoking prevalence for all population groups. So if achieving 5% or less overall, but still having very high prevalence amongst Māori, for example, was not an acceptable situation. But what was common across all the countries was that they were struggling to reduce these disparities, and that was highlighted in the strategies and monitoring reports and so on. From the experience of the 6 countries, there were some enablers identified, and I don't think any of these will be of great surprise to anyone. So obviously sort of broad political support is helpful, specifically strong government commitment and a strategy and a time frame, strong public support, strong NGO and NGO advocacy sector, cross-sectoral collaboration and structures to support that, and review mechanisms and evaluation research. So I think all of these are fairly intuitive enablers of endgame goals and progress. This is just to illustrate the thing about cross-sector working and how this was particularly strong in Finland, Scotland, Ireland, and Sweden, in the sense that there were actually government mechanisms to try and promote and support collaboration and coordination of the civil society and NGOs. In Scotland, for example, there's this Charter for a Tobacco-Free Generation, which I think is a really good initiative. So they get a whole bunch of organisations, including sort of health organisations and NGOs and so on, but also businesses and business organisations, community organisations, to sign up to support the Scottish goal. And they've got they're hoping to get that up to 500 next year, organisations signed up. So that was a lot of the sort of good things, but some of the challenges or threats that were identified included competing political priorities. Again, that would be no surprise, I think. As I said, persisting disparities, inequities in smoking, somewhat patchy application of some of the proven core measures, and say that was particularly the case in Sweden. Lack of bold endgame measures, resources and capacity for the smoke-free sector, and then sometimes a lack of unity in the tobacco control community, and that often is around the issue of harm reduction and divergences of opinion on that. And of course, the tobacco industry and its opposition and its tactics to try and stop policy implementation and so on. So I think from our initial sort of conclusions were that the diversity of goals and approaches is fine. Of course, there's going to be different ways of setting goals and trying to meet them. Addressing inequity is an absolutely priority challenge for any country with an endgame goal. And the experience in these countries was that there was really a need to intensify measures and consider bolder interventions, and that hopefully the learning from different countries, we can each learn from each other. So the situation with that project is we're now collecting data for 2022, and that should be done by the end of the year. Some of the things that we know are happening in Canada, there's been a proposal to introduce dissuasive sticks with warnings on them, which would be a first. There was an Endgame summit in 2021, but that wasn't the government summit. That was a sort of civil NGO summit. In Finland, a working group's going to make further proposals this year. In Ireland, there has been a new tobacco-free Ireland plan released, although that doesn't include any particularly bold measures, I don't think. But as was presented at a webinar a few weeks back by Ellen Cosgrove and Paul Kavanagh, I think, they've just done a survey of support for endgame measures in Ireland, which was very high. And then New Zealand, and I'm going to talk about that further because that's the one country which has really changed quite a lot, because we've gone from having no strategy or action plan to having a really bold action plan with endgame measures in it. Scotland is due to launch a new strategy in 2023. We don't know what that's going to look like. And Sweden, nothing much new on the horizon. But having said that, Sweden has only, I think Coral mentioned this earlier, has only 6% smoking prevalence. So Sweden is actually doing very, very well. Okay, so I'm going to move on to developments in New Zealand. So the key thing here was that in April last year, a draft action plan was put forward. There was a consultation, and then the final action plan was launched in December 2021 by Associate Minister Verrill, who's pictured there. And this included 6 focus areas. It had a very strong commitment to Māori governance and leadership. Increased what you might call business as usual measures like mass media, health promotion, community mobilization, enhanced targeted cessation services. But what I'm going to focus on is where the sort of endgame measures that are included in that plan, which are relate to the supply and the product itself. So the plan included these 3 measures that are highlighted here, and these have now been introduced into Parliament in July, and they're currently being considered by the Health Select Committee, and there's just been a consultation process that's just been finished, and we expect the Select Committee will report back, I think it's in November, and we expect the bill to go through in December. That's the timetable that we think is being worked to. So the 3 key measures are mandated denicotinization of all smoked tobacco products, greatly reduced retail availability of smoked tobacco products, and smoke-free generation, in which people born after a certain date, 1st of January 2009, will not legally be able to be sold smoked tobacco products. So those are the 3 measures, and those are measures that are commonly included in that list of endgame measures. The next steps with that is that I said there's a consultation process, and that legislation should get through Parliament by the end of the year. There are some other actions that are underway. So, for example, Māori and Pacific task forces have been established for governance of the action plan. Some of those enhanced health promotion, community mobilization, mass media and cessation support funding has been allocated, and sort of plans and implementation is underway or has started with that. And there's been some increased funding for customs for looking at minimizing smuggled imports and so on. And we expect there'll be a progressive implementation of those 3 key measures over the next 3 or 4 years. So I think what's some of the key features of this plan is it's a really comprehensive approach, and it includes measures that go beyond business as usual. It maintains the focus on eliminating inequities, and it has this very strong commitment to strengthening Māori engagement and governance, and Pacific governance as well. And it includes measures to address and greatly reduce supply and to alter the nature of the product. And these are areas of tobacco control that are rarely implemented in any robust form anywhere around the world. The exception to that, particularly more recently, has been on removing menthol, which we've seen in the EU and Canada. And there are some supply measures like licensing and so on, but we haven't seen really big reductions in supply, as we saw in one of the presentations earlier, except possibly in Hungary. But even what's proposed in New Zealand is going beyond what's happened in Hungary. So I believe, and there's some debate about this, but I believe that if fully implemented, this should ensure that smoke-free 2025 is achieved for all peoples. It may not be achieved quite by 2025 though, because the measures are only just being rolled out, but if not, shortly afterwards. The other thing I haven't talked about e-cigarettes and vaping and so on here, that we have a context in New Zealand where those products are pretty widely available. And as you know, there's lots of debate about that, but arguably they could be synergistic and with some of the measures included in this action plan to help reduce smoking prevalence. And this possibly has wider global implications. If this is a successful approach, this could be a precedent or a blueprint, or at least something that people may want to look at to influence their own approaches. So that's about the endgame goals and strategies and plans. And I just wanted to move on to the endgame interventions, the individual measures. Chenille and Coral and team carried out this paper in which endgame, the evidence of reviews and synthesis and modeling studies of these different endgame interventions was looked at. And what I want to highlight here is just the degree of evidence. Where the numbers are in green, that means that to some extent this is actually been implemented, whereas if they're in black, it has not been implemented, at least not at national level. So this is the number of studies that have synthesized evidence. And as you can see, by far the largest number is on mandated nicotine reduction. Not a lot on the others, except for replacing combusted with non-combusted products. And that's, of course, looking at vaping and e-cigarettes and so on. And there's actually lots more reviews on that topic. As we know, there's a huge amount of research. But this, I think, was looking at reviews that looked at for evidence of vaping and e-cigarettes as an endgame intervention. So that's why the number there is relatively small. And then if we look at the supply side measures, there's been quite a lot on retailers and on price related measures. You can see there in terms of implementation, there's been some implementation of retailer measures, and that's really because there have been some, you could argue that Hungary is an example of that. In terms of ending commercial supply altogether, there was the Bhutan example, and there are one or two towns in Beverly Hills and Manhattan Beach, I think it's called, in California that have done this, but not a lot, and none at all of the market structures and performance-based regulation. So there's limited evidence, but when we look at the evidence for denicotinization, this is the one which has the most substantial. There is quite a lot there. So first of all, you can look at the logic and the theory. And I think for all of these measures, you can make a case on logical or theoretical grounds. You can probably also make a case for why it might not work. But in terms of denicotinization, there's a pretty obvious logical case. And this is a quote from British American Tobacco in 1959, which sort of says they understand the case very clearly. If you take the nicotine out of tobacco products, or virtually take it out, a lot of people might quit, and people experimenting with tobacco are unlikely to become addicted and long-term smokers. That's the logic. And then there's quite a lot of evidence, at least for the quitting side of the equation, not so much the uptake. And this comes from I would imagine there's now 20, 30 or 40 studies of this nature, most of them randomized controlled trials, where these sort of low nicotine cigarettes have been given to people, various populations of people in various settings in various ways. And the usual finding is they don't like them. They don't relieve cravings very well. They smoke less, provided the cigarettes are very low nicotine. So they're less exposed to toxins, and they're more likely to try to quit and succeed. Now, that's not true in all of the studies, but I think that's true in most of them. And there's really obvious possible synergies here with vaping, because both in terms of the feasibility of this and also its impact. If you've got an alternative nicotine product available, that's likely to be helpful for the implementation of this measure. This is just an example, a recent example of a study. This was done in smokers with a history of depression or anxiety disorders. They were about 180 or so who were randomized to being given very low nicotine cigarettes or to smoke their normal cigarettes. And you can see there that the bottom line, the lighter sort of gray, is the low nicotine group. And so over time, they tended to smoke less. They were less dependent. They had less toxins, in this case, a metabolite of one of the carcinogens. Interestingly, in this study, there was no difference in stress, perceived stress, and a variety of other indicators of sort of well-being and mental health, because that's one of the objections that's sometimes made. And the quit rates were really quite substantially different, much higher in the reduced nicotine group. So you know, a pretty promising study in a priority population group. There's been modelling studies, such as this one led by Drisait Wakrim and Tony Blakely and team. And as has been noted previously in the presentations, it very much depends on assumptions and things, of course, but in this study, it was predicted that there would be dramatic reductions in smoking prevalence, and the top lines here are Māori smoking prevalence, because there are big disparities in smoking prevalence in New Zealand, and shows a really rapid reduction in prevalence. This is from the New Zealand ITC survey, where we asked people if there was a very substantial reduction in retailer numbers, or if the only cigarettes you could get hold of, or tobacco you could get hold of, was denicotinized, what would you do? And about a quarter said they would quit, either quit entirely or switch to vaping. Another quarter said they would cut down. So quite substantial proportions saying, anticipating, and this is obviously their best guess, that this would have an effect on them. I think in the interest of time, I will skip over that because it's complicated. It was just to make the point that some of these interventions, you have to think really carefully about how you evaluate the different components of it, and particularly how you get evidence for sort of mediating variables which indicate that it's actually the policy that's having an effect. We always, with all of these measures, we need to think about unintended consequences, and one of those is impacts on illicit trade, and this is something in New Zealand the tobacco industry is talking about all the time. And this is data from the New Zealand ITC about current purchase of such products, and we need to monitor that over time. We do know quite a lot about support for these measures, and there's an increasing number of studies now coming out showing this. This is again from New Zealand, showing support amongst smokers and recent quitters. So things like denicotinized products, we find very high levels of support, even amongst smokers, over 70%. Similarly for smoke-free generation, less so for reducing retail outlets. Of course, you can question whether people fully understand the import of these policies, but these findings are pretty consistent, at least. And this is from the Irish study that was presented in the webinar. This is a general population, so not just smokers or recent quitters. And again, support for lowering nicotine was 86% in the whole population, 78% amongst smokers. Tobacco-free generation, not such strong support as we found in New Zealand. similar levels of support for reducing number of places that sell tobacco products. And this is early days because there's not always full understanding. What has happened in the past with smoke-free policies is that supports tended to increase post-implementation. That may or may not happen again. And finally, just some other developments, and again, I think some of these have been touched on, but there is quite a lot going on. I wanted to mention that this is not a new development, it's an old one. There's the Tobacco-Free Pacific Regional Goal, which was adopted, I think, in 2014 or 15. In England has recently adopted a smoke-free 2030 goal, and then there was the Khan review, which is not a government policy, but it's an independent review, which has proposed a lot of quite radical measures and a very comprehensive program. Denmark and Malaysia have been talking about tobacco-free generation proposals. As I said, there have been some local bans on retail sales. There's local implementation of tobacco-free generation in Brookline, and it was in Balanga in Philippines, but that's been stalled, I think, by tobacco industry legal challenge. California's adopted an endgame goal. I think Hawaii might have as well. In the US, some very low nicotine products have been introduced recently, and there's talk about introducing the mandated low nicotine standard. I think we all know that's not going to happen anytime soon, given the FDA processes, but at least it's sort of on the agenda. And then we have the Project Sunset Group, which is bringing together thinking and advocacy internationally for endgames. So there's lots going on. The final thing I was going to mention was about the tobacco industry. How are they responding? Well, this is quite interesting because there's this narrative of tobacco industry transformation, and people like Philip Morris are talking about, they announced their intention to transform in 2016, and they talk about unsmoking the world and so on. And they, of course, launched the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World to carry out research to support that. British American Tobacco is talking about building a better tomorrow and focusing on reduced risk alternatives and an accelerating transformation. Imperial, to some degree, and Altria also is getting quite prominent in this field as well. So if you go onto their websites, you can see all this stuff about transformation and so on. We did a paper which was in the anniversary edition of Tobacco Control, looking at critically evaluating tobacco industry transformation and developing a definition and some criteria for what a transformed industry might look like. I won't go through that in detail, but our key thing was the definition, which was that there should be evidence of substantial progress towards eliminating the production, distribution, marketing and sales of conventional tobacco products within 5 years, and then not obstructing tobacco control policy. Those sorts of things were the essential criterion, and then the non-essential criterion was about switching to other products, which is fine as long as you're doing the first things as well. This came out this week. This was the Tobacco Transformation Index report, which is produced by the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World. And I think it's quite interesting. They're one of the key statements there. Simply put, the tobacco industry is not phasing out that's high-risk tobacco products, HRPs, and or transitioning smokers to reduce risk products quickly enough to achieve the Foundation's mission of ending smoking in this generation. That there needs to be urgent acceleration. So that's the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World, and you know, there are some questions about that that project, I would say, but nevertheless they come to that conclusion. And this is one of the graphs where they show the overall is the darker blue is what's happening with tobacco cigarette sales worldwide, and a projection on current trends going out to 2050. And you can see that the reduction is pretty glacial, and it's certainly nowhere near, even by 2050, eliminating smoked tobacco. So that's from sort of industry sort of led research, if you like. Just looking at things in New Zealand in terms of transformation. So I'd say PMI are sort of the cheerleaders, I would say, of this. There was a thing about them offering to stop selling cigarettes in New Zealand in 2019. But when you looked at it, what they actually said is they would stop the sale of cigarettes in New Zealand when required to by law, which to me is not really saying anything, because the tobacco industry is pretty good generally at complying where there are laws. So they were saying, well, if we're actually told to, then we'll do it. But when asked, well, why don't you just do it? They said, well, it's complicated. There are some other things that seem inconsistent with transformation. So capsule cigarettes and design innovations. Why, if you're a transformed tobacco industry, do you introduce or continue to make available cigarettes like capsule cigarettes, which have been shown to particularly appeal to young people and therefore promote uptake of smoking? And yet Marlboro Ice Blast is available in New Zealand and in many, many markets. And other tobacco companies make these products and continue to make them. Here was a very specific example. Again, just in July, PMI launched a new cigarillo brand in New Zealand. And what was interesting about that is, well, why introduce a new brand? Surely the only reason you introduce a new brand into a market is to increase your sales and your market share. Doesn't seem consistent with a transformed company. And this product, because it's a cigarillo, so it's slightly different, and because of the vagaries of the excise laws in New Zealand, it can be sold at a cheaper price, so it undercuts the tax tobacco excise strategy. Again, why would PMI, the transformed company, do that? When the action plan came out, there were protests from retailers, which is understandable, but what came out in the press was that one of the ways that these protests were being fomented, if you like, or supported, was by British American Tobacco, another sort of transformed company. And we know that because their calling card was on one of the postcards that was sent in by retailers. And when you look at the proposals that were in the draft action plan, there was a whole raft of sort of policy proposals, including the three that I've mentioned. And BAT, Imperial and JTI pretty much opposed everything. And this slide comes courtesy of Lindsay Robertson. And they've just submitted and opposed these measures to the select committee. PMI, interestingly, hasn't said a word. The company that's most interested in transformation has not had made any comment about New Zealand's plan, which seems somewhat bizarre. So to summarize then where we are with progress and priorities. With progress, first of all, endgame goals are spreading slowly. The experiences, I think, are mostly moderate or moderately positive. They're certainly not a panacea. They're probably not appropriate for every setting. I think it's been mentioned before, maybe lower middle income countries may not be appropriate. A diversity in approach is absolutely fine and is to be expected, and inequity is a key issue. Endgame interventions are really only just starting to be proposed and implemented, particularly at national level. And so the evidence for feasibility and impact and so on is very, very limited because they haven't been implemented. I haven't really talked about e-cigarettes in great detail just because of time, but they could be one of those endgame interventions, and they could also be synergistic to some of those interventions. Of course, there's lots of debate about that as to whether that's the case, but I do think there are dangers of we end up talking forever about e-cigarette regulation and e-cigarettes, and we don't spend enough time talking about the other possible interventions. And there is the issue of division, which is not the fault of e-cigarettes. It's just the way the debate plays out. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to keep that debate civilized and respect different positions. I would say let's not rely on the tobacco industry because so far I don't think there's any evidence that they are serious about transforming in terms of reducing their smoked tobacco product sales. The progress has been very slow, and they continue to oppose policy. And ultimately, the progress is really likely to depend, as ever, on politics and the political determinants of health, and what degree of political will there is, who wins the arguments, the framing of the arguments, and so on. So some of the things I think that Colleen was talking about. In terms of priorities, I think a priority must be we really need to implement some of these measures to see what happens. In the clinical world, we often talk about there being equipoise. And if there's equipoise, you don't know if, say, treatment A is better than treatment B. The answer to that is you do a randomized controlled trial, or you do rigorous research to find out which is the best. We really need to know whether some of these measures are good ones or not. And so I think we should really support where they are being implemented, to not least just to see what happens. And if they don't work, that's fine. And if they have terrible unintended consequences, then they should be, not supported or withdrawn. But we need to find out. And so I think we need to advocate for these measures as well. And of course, we need lots more research. And again, as Colleen mentioned, effective dissemination and communication of that research to maximize its influence. And that's in the form of formative and pre-implementation research. When these measures are implemented, really thorough evaluation to assess their feasibility, their effectiveness, their impacts on equity, the unintended consequences. The experience of people who smoke is really important, because we don't want to be stigmatizing and disadvantaging people who smoke. We want to be supporting them to quit, which of course most of them want to do. And we need to also look at the policy synergy and interaction between different interventions. What's the best mix? We also need research, again, I think as Colleen was talking about how to promote policy implementation, because the biggest block is even when there's good evidence, we just can't get things implemented. And this comes back to the political determinants and research on advocacy and implementation strategies and so on, which we don't tend to do very much of. We focus much more on the intervention and developing it and evaluating it, but not so much about how we get it implemented in the first place. And then, of course, there's areas for debate. What about endgames in other settings? What about next steps? Is an endgame for smoking enough? Should we be talking about nicotine-free endgames? All sorts of other issues as well, which are either current debates or certainly ones for the future. So I'll leave it there. We have got a website devoted to the action plan, which has lots of resources if you're interested in it. We write a lot of blogs about the different measures and things on the Public Health Expert site. Yeah, I'll stop there.